On Thanksgiving, my multimillionaire son set his fork down, smiled across the table like a man certain he'd done right by his father, and asked me how I was enjoying the lake house he bought me 2 years ago. For a heartbeat I thought he was teasing, testing the old man's memory. A lake house. While I've been patching the blistered paint in a rented duplex and cutting blood pressure pills into careful halves so they'd last to the end of the month. He believed I was watching sunsets pour themselves over the water like hot copper. Before I take you into what happened next, please subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from, because what unfolded in my dining room is the kind of truth people carry quietly until it finally demands a witness. I looked at my son, Michael, the boy who once begged me to hold the back of his bicycle seat, and said, as evenly as I could, "I don't own a lake house." The smile slid off his face as cleanly as a plate leaving soap. Across from him, Clara, my daughter-in-law, tightened her grip on a crystal stem until I heard the soft click of glass against porcelain. That sound lives in me now, the way the house holds heat in its bones long after the oven door shuts. Steam twisted from the gravy boat and hung there, stubborn, as if the room itself had forgotten how to breathe. The wind crawled along the siding and pressed a thin, insistent palm against the window. I carved slow buying seconds the way a man buys small mercies when the bigger ones won't come. The breast held under the knife, then surrendered in neat white fans. My wrist ached where the cold finds old work first, the valve-turning ache from years at the maintenance job after Grace died. I set the slices down and finally lifted my eyes to my son. Michael's face, that careful boardroom mask he's learned to wear, showed a flicker of something. The ing he doesn't let investors see. Doubt. He glanced toward Clara for the reflex of marital reassurance and found only the tremble in her hand, the way her napkin wouldn't lie flat. She stood abruptly, murmured something about a call she had to return, and the little heels she favors whispered down the hall toward my kitchen, where the pumpkin pie I'd baked at dawn filled the air with cinnamon, brave enough to pretend it could fix anything. Michael cleared his throat. "Dad, I handled the deed, the utilities, everything. I set up monthly support so the house wouldn't be a burden. You were supposed to receive a packet, transfers every month. I slid the knife's blunt guard over the blade because work you can name steadies what you can't. Son," I said, "I've been living on wages and the pension since we buried your mother. You know the blue envelopes stacked by my lamp? If any money had walked into this house, I would have shaken its hand and written down its name." Silence purred then, the kind that isn't empty, the kind that has plans. From the kitchen, I heard Clara's voice drop to a hush and flatten into nothing, the way a lie stops mid-sentence when it realizes the room is listening. Michael's jaw worked. He put his palm up on the table like he was 5 again, and couldn't decide where to put his hands in the presence of a truth too big for them. "That's not possible," he whispered. I looked at the old photograph on the sideboard. Grace on a July morning, lake behind her like a sheet of steel. She was listening to something only she could hear. I heard it too now. A low, steady warning that said the storm wasn't coming. It was already in the house, sitting at my table, drinking my wine, and calling itself family. Michael pressed his palms together as if prayer might untangle numbers, wires, and paper trails. He swore again that every month, without fail, he had transferred $2,000 into my account. He leaned forward, eyes fierce now, and told me he had made sure of it. Automatic deposits, all tracked, the kind of financial discipline that made him the man investors trusted. I sat there, the old gravy cooling on the porcelain, thinking about the holes in my socks I stitched by lamplight, the cans of soup stretched with water, and the winters where I counted quarters for heating oil. "There was never a deposit, son," I said, voice steady like the line a carpenter strikes across wood before the saw. The words sat heavy between us. He shook his head, his confidence faltering for the first time since he walked into the house that evening. The shame of my poverty threatened to rise in me, but I clamped it down. I thought of Grace, her voice reminding me that dignity is not found in wealth, but in truth. Still, truth cut like glass. I'd bent my back under roofs that leaked and pipes that groaned, yet my son believed I had been living quietly on his generosity in a house that kissed the water each morning. Clara's heels clicked against the floor as she returned. She had a glow about her, the kind born not of heat, but of secrecy. She sat carefully, eyes lowered, but her fingers betrayed her, fidgeting with the chain at her throat. I studied her while Michael stared at me as though staring harder could force my story into another shape. I reached for the bread basket, tore a piece, chewed, swallowed. Small acts anchor a man when the earth starts to shift beneath his feet. Michael, I said quietly, for 2 years I have balanced groceries against prescriptions, light bills against shoes. If any such money had reached me, the world would look different. His jaw tightened. He rifled through his phone, muttering numbers, account names. Clara's hand twitched toward him, then froze, like a thief caught reaching before the act was complete. I watched her reflection in the polished silver of the gravy spoon, eyes darting, breath quickened, the tiny betrayals of a body that knows its lies are close to being uncovered. The wind outside grew restless, pushing the window pane like a guest too impatient to knock. My old dog barked once in the yard and then fell silent. Inside, the air swelled with unspoken things. Michael finally looked up, his certainty fractured. "Dad, I'll bring the records tomorrow," he promised, though it sounded more like he was promising himself that the ground hadn't already cracked. Clara smiled, too quickly, too thinly, the smile of a woman rehearsing denial before the script is written. And I, sitting with the weight of years and the hunger of nights never confessed, realized something was slithering through my family's bloodline that no feast could disguise. I leaned back in my chair and felt the bones of my spine protest, each one a ledger of labor I had written with my body long after Grace had gone. She had been the quiet strength of this house, her hands always busy with mending, her laughter tucked into corners like folded linens. When cancer stole her from me, it also stole the cushion of comfort we'd built together. What remained was me, a man patching holes in roofs for neighbors, scrubbing oil stains from garage floors, and taking every maintenance call that came my way just to keep the lights warm. Those years blurred into one another, a string of gray mornings where I packed my own sandwiches in wax paper and carried a thermos to jobs that wore me thin. Through it all, I thought at least I had raised a son who had climbed out of scarcity and into abundance. I thought Michael's success was our family's shared reward. But now, as I studied him across the table, his certainty unraveling like thread pulled from a sleeve, I saw the widening chasm between what he believed and the life I'd been forced to live. He imagined me strolling down docks at sunset, sipping coffee on a porch that overlooked calm water. In truth, I had spent winters boiling water on the stove to chase the frost from my breath. I thought of the nights I counted pills, cutting one in half, then half again, stretching out the prescription because the copay was too high. Each compromise had been a private surrender, a secret no father wants his son to see, and yet here he was, insisting he had given me the means to live easier. Grace would have known what to say. She would have touched my hand beneath the table, her thumb a small circle on my skin, steadying me. I imagined her voice in the space between us, telling me that lies always rot from the inside, no matter how polished the outside appears. Clara returned from the kitchen, her perfume trailing. G before her like smoke curling from a hidden fire. She sat down without looking at me, lifting her glass with a tremor she hoped went unnoticed. But I saw it. I saw it the way I once saw a hairline crack in a pipe that, left alone, would flood the whole basement. Michael, trying to salvage control, asked again if I was certain. His tone carried the faint edge of desperation, as though my denial was more dangerous to him than the possibility of betrayal. "I'm sure, son," I answered, my voice gravel-steady. "If you had given me a house, if you had given me money, it never reached me." I watched his face change, hope flickering out like a candle meeting wind. Clara dabbed her mouth with her napkin, though she had eaten nothing. The silence settled deep, thicker than gravy, heavier than truth. And I knew then, as certain as I knew my own name, that the enemy was not some clerical error in a bank. The enemy had been sitting at this table all along, close enough to refill my glass and call me family. Michael's hands trembled as he scrolled furiously through his phone, his thumb dragging across the glass with the desperation of a man searching for proof that his reality was not unraveling. He pulled up screenshots of transfers, each one marked clearly $2,000 month after month for 2 years. He turned the screen toward me with the conviction of someone who believed evidence was the same as truth. "Look," he said, his voice cracking under its own weight. "It's all here. I made sure you were taken care of. You were never supposed to struggle again." I leaned forward, squinting at the numbers. Yes, the sums were there, neat as rows of corn, but the account number beside them was not mine. My blood ran cold, and yet my voice came out even, as if I'd been expecting this all along. "That's not my account," I told him. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner, a steady, indifferent drone that seemed to mock the chaos swelling inside us. I thought back to nights spent hunched over the kitchen table with bills fanned out like a losing hand of cards. I remembered the sting of asking the pharmacist to run my insurance twice, praying it might shave off a few dollars. And I thought of Grace, how she had once said our family's strength would always be in facing hardship together. But here was proof that hardship had been needlessly endured, while someone else feasted on what was meant for me. Michael sat back, eyes glassy with disbelief, and for the first time in years, I saw not the accomplished businessman, but the boy who used to come home with scraped knees, looking at me for answers. Clara re-entered the room then, her face arranged into something too careful to be natural. She carried herself like a performer returning to the stage after forgetting her lines, smoothing her dress as if that alone could mend the fracture in the air. She avoided my gaze, instead reaching to pour more wine into Michael's glass. Her hand shook so slightly it would have gone unnoticed by most, but not by me. Years of working with broken things had trained me to see the smallest fault lines before they became disasters. Michael pressed his fingertips to his temples, exhaling sharp through his nose. "Then where did it go?" he muttered, more to himself than to me. His voice held the brittle edge of a man realizing the ground beneath him was not stone but ice, thin and cracking. I watched him wrestle with the truth, a truth too heavy for a holiday table. Clara sat quietly, her eyes fixed on her plate, but her silence was louder than any confession. And in that silence, in the way she shrank from Michael's searching glance, I saw the betrayal begin to take shape, jagged and undeniable, like a shadow finally stepping into the light. I sat there, letting the silence spread like water through a crack in the floorboards, and in that silence, memories rose unbidden. They weren't dramatic scenes, not the kind that announced themselves as betrayals at the time, but quiet, creeping moments that only now, under the harsh light of truth, revealed their shape. I remembered when Clara first insisted on handling the utility bills. "You shouldn't worry about paperwork at your age," she had said sweetly, slipping the envelopes from my hands like she was doing me a kindness. At the time, I let her. I thought she was being thoughtful, a modern woman smoothing the edges of an old man's burdens. But one by one, the little tasks that tethered me to control of my own life disappeared into her keeping. She started with the gas bill, then the electric. Soon after, she offered to set up automatic payments for my phone, my insurance, even the property taxes on the duplex I rented out. She said it would all be easier for me that way, and I, tired, worn from long shifts and grateful for any hand extended, nodded and let her. I see it clearly now. Those were not kindnesses, but rehearsals. Rehearsals for something larger, darker, calculated. She had been building a quiet empire in my name, brick by stolen brick, while I was none the wiser. I remembered the day she asked for my driver's license, claiming she needed it to confirm something with the bank. She was standing in my kitchen then, sun spilling across the counter, her voice light as air, and I thought nothing of it. She handed it back within minutes, and I never suspected she might have copied the numbers down or filed them away for some later use. I remembered, too, how she once borrowed the key to Grace's cedar chest, said she wanted to see old family photographs. I had handed it over without thought, touched that she cared about the woman who raised Michael and stood by me through storms. Only now did I feel the sting of that memory, because the chest had held more than pictures. It had held papers, insurance forms, tax records, documents ripe for misuse. As these moments stitched themselves together in my mind, the truth began to pulse like a bruise. Clara hadn't stumbled into deceit. She had charted it, measured it, and executed it with the patience of someone rearranging a chessboard piece by piece until victory was assured. Michael sat beside her, still lost in the fog of disbelief, but I no longer shared his confusion. My years of scraping by had taught me the difference between accidents and patterns, and what I saw before me now was no accident. It was a pattern woven tight around my life, so tight it threw a tend to choke the last bit of trust from my lungs. I folded my napkin carefully, deliberately, because rage can wait. Rage must wait, if truth is to survive the telling. The knife of memory cut deeper that night, dragging me back to the years after Grace passed, when work was all I had left to keep the roof overhead. I took any job I could find, patching pipes that leaked into people's kitchens, hauling scrap wood from construction sites, crawling through attics where dust stung the back of my throat. Winters bit harder then. My coat was too thin, the soles of my boots too worn, but I kept moving, kept working, because stopping meant listening too long to the silence Grace had left behind. Those years etched themselves into my body, the stiffness in my knees, the ache in my back that woke me at dawn whether I wanted it or not. I told myself the struggle was worth it, that Michael's rise meant the family's name would carry strength, that he'd never know the hunger or cold that shaped me. Michael had always been sharp, eager, restless to carve out a world larger than the one I could offer him. I remember watching him walk across the stage at his college graduation, his handshake firm, his smile lit with ambition. He stepped quickly into business, and success followed him like a shadow that never left. He wore tailored suits while I wore the same patch jacket year after year, but I carried pride instead of envy. Every deal he closed, every property he bought, I thought of as proof that all my sacrifices had planted good seed. I convinced myself that the cracks in my life were worth it if his foundation stood strong. And then Clara entered. Polished, poised, the kind of woman who always knew which fork to use at a table set too fine for men like me. She carried herself like someone who had never mopped a floor on her knees or counted pennies at the grocery store. At first, I tried to welcome her. She smiled often, offered me tea in expensive cups, asked questions about Grace, as if she wanted to honor her memory. I believed she loved my son, and perhaps she did in her own way, but her love was braided tightly with ambition. Slowly she stepped between us, always under the guise of helping. She spoke for Michael in small matters, then in larger ones. She handled his schedules, his investments, his household, and soon enough she handled me, my bills, my mail, my very name on paper. What I once saw as thoughtfulness now stood exposed as strategy. That Thanksgiving night, as the truth unraveled thread by thread, I realized Clara hadn't merely attached herself to Michael's success. She had been rewriting the script of my life, using my name and his money to build a world where she held the pen, and I was reduced to a footnote. My son sat there, blind to the strings she pulled, but I saw them clearly now, as if the years of labor had trained my eyes to find the weakness in every structure. And in Clara's structure, I saw not weakness, but cunning, polished and patient, biding its time until the house of cards could no longer stand unseen. The warmth of the turkey had long since faded. The mashed potatoes sat in heavy clumps on the serving platter, and the pie I had risen bias for Dawn to bake cooled untouched in the kitchen. The holiday had turned into a stage where silence and suspicion played louder than any blessing. I set my fork down and folded my hands, watching my son wrestle with numbers on his phone as if they might rearrange themselves into mercy. When his eyes finally met mine, there was no triumph left in them, only the unsteady flicker of doubt. I spoke softly, because truth does not need volume to be heard. If there's a house in my name, Michael, I have never set foot in it. The words seemed to rattle him harder than a shout would have. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again, like a man drowning who cannot decide whether to breathe or to sink. Clara shifted in her chair, her napkin twisted into a rope between her fingers. Her smile had vanished, replaced by the rigid calm of someone bracing for impact. I could see her chest rise and fall in shallow breaths, each one betraying what her lips refused to admit. Michael rubbed his forehead, his other hand tapping against the table in a restless rhythm. "That can't be," he murmured. "The deed, the transfers, everything's documented." He looked at me as though I had misplaced the gift myself, as if his generosity had been wasted on my forgetfulness. But there was no forgetting a lake house. There was only the absence of it. The candles sputtered as a draft crept in, making the shadows stretch long across the walls, distorting them until even familiar objects looked like strangers. I remembered how many Thanksgivings had passed with an empty chair where Grace should have been, and how I had forced myself to smile for Michael's sake. Now, watching my son flounder, I felt the ache of her absence more sharply than ever. She would have known how to steady him, how to draw the truth out without tearing the family apart. But she was gone, and it was left to me to hold the line. Michael finally exhaled, long and hard, and said he would bring the paperwork tomorrow. His tone was sharp with determination, but I heard the tremor underneath, the same tremor that comes when a man realizes his confidence has cracks running deep. Clara kept her gaze on her lap, her silence ringing louder than any confession. No one reached for seconds. The meal ended in half-finished plates and half-spoken thoughts, the scrape of utensils against china sounding like shovels in the dirt. When they left that night, the door closed behind them with a weight that told me the holiday was over, not just for the year, but for the life we thought we had. And in that silence, my house felt less like a home and more like a waiting room for storms yet to come. Morning came gray and brittle, the kind of light that makes every flaw in the paint, every crack in the glass, show itself without apology. I sat in my chair by the window, coffee cooling in my hands, waiting for the sound of tires on gravel. When Michael's car finally pulled up, it carried more than his frame. It carried the burden of answers, and I braced myself for whatever weight he would lay at my feet. He stepped inside without his usual easy stride, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm, and a cardboard box balanced in his hands. He looked at me not as a son greeting a father, but as a man approaching a reckoning. We spread the papers across my worn kitchen table, the same table where Grace used to knead dough and where I once taught Michael how to balance a checkbook. Receipts, statements, contracts, his world of numbers and mine of survival collided there, paper against wood. He flipped through printouts of transfers, each one highlighted, neat as soldiers in a row, $2,000, sent faithfully every month for 2 years. "It's all here," he said, voice tight with frustration and a hint of pleading, as if he needed me to confirm his reality. My eyes traced the lines, and then I stopped. The account number. It was not mine, not even close. "Son," I said, pressing my finger against the digits, "this isn't my account." The air shifted between us, heavy with something neither of us wanted to name. Michael frowned, shaking his head, insisting that it couldn't be, that his assistant had set everything up with Clara's help, that he had double-checked the details himself. He rifled through the box and pulled out copies of emails, messages he had sent to Clara, confirmation notes, supposedly from me, all neatly printed. The words were mine in form, but not in spirit. I knew I had never written them. The sentences were too polished, the tone too formal. They were a forgery clothed in my voice. I felt the ground tilt beneath me, yet my body stayed still. The years of bending pipe and patching leaks had trained me to hold steady, even when the walls groaned around me. I met Michael's eyes, and for the first time, I saw fear there. Not fear of me, but fear of what the truth meant for everything he thought he knew. Clara's name hovered unspoken between us, a shadow stretching longer with every page we turned. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became. The money had not vanished into the ether. It had been rerouted, carefully, deliberately, into hands that wore the mask of family. Michael dropped heavily into a chair, his knuckles white around the edge of the portfolio. "If it wasn't you," he said quietly, "then someone has been living as you." His words settled on the table like dust, and I realized he was right. Somewhere out there, a stranger had been fashioned in my image, built from stolen numbers and forged lines, while I had been left to rot in the shell of a life stripped bare. And the cruelest part of all was that the stranger wasn't a stranger at all. The stranger was inside my house, breaking bread at my table, calling me father. Michael's eyes darted over the paperwork again and again, as if repetition might make the numbers bend to his will. He kept muttering, "This isn't possible. It can't be," like a prayer unraveling on his lips. But the truth was sitting in front of us, bold in ink. An account opened in my name, but with an address I had never lived at, a number I had never known. I leaned back slowly, the chair creaking beneath me, my hands folded to keep them from trembling. My son had always trusted systems, contracts, ledgers, digital trails, but I knew from a lifetime of labor that people could rot those systems from the inside. And here it was, proof written plain. Someone had taken my name and stitched it into a life that wasn't mine. "Michael." As voice grew sharp, "This had to be set up by someone close. An account like this doesn't just appear. It needs ID, signatures, verification." He rubbed his jaw, the stubble rasping under his palm, and for the first time his polished confidence broke into raw anger. His thoughts circled one name, though he wouldn't say it aloud. Clara. She had been the one in charge of mailing things, of handling documents, of smoothing over details that I had never seen. The memory of her borrowing Grace's cedar chest key struck me like a hammer. I remembered the faint scent of her perfume lingering long after she had left, and how I never thought to check what she had handled. I steadied my voice. "Son, this wasn't an accident. This was built. Someone put time into this." I tapped the forged documents with a finger hardened by years of wrench work. "And whoever did it They knew where to find the pieces of me that could be copied. Michael finally met my gaze, and for the first time I saw him afraid, not of poverty, not of losing money, but of realizing that the betrayal wasn't some faceless thief behind a computer screen. It was in his own home. Clara's name hovered like a shadow between us, unspoken but growing heavier. Michael clenched his fists, the veins in his hands standing out like wires under strain. He shook his head, as though shaking hard enough could fling away the thought, but it clung to him, to us both. He whispered, "If it's true, then she's been lying to me for years." His words weren't meant for me. They were confessions to himself, admissions of doubt that had been gnawing quietly in his chest long before tonight. I laid my hand flat on the papers, the way I might on a blueprint before starting work. "We'll follow the trail," I told him. "Every dollar leaves footprints, and footprints don't lie, even if people do." My voice didn't rise, but the steel in it made him look at me differently. The old man he had pitied for living small suddenly became the man who had carried weight his whole life. And in that moment, Michael realized the storm wasn't approaching. It was already here, and it had Clara's fingerprints all over it. Michael shuffled through the transfers again, his breath quickening as if the papers themselves were suffocating him. He traced the notes attached to each deposit, small annotations meant to show care. For Dad's medication, holiday expenses, dentist, winter clothes. The words were a cruel echo of needs I had carried quietly, sacrifices I had made in silence, while Clara lived fat on what was meant to ease my burden. Each memo line was like a knife, carved in neat handwriting, reminding me of the nights I had gone to bed hungry so I could afford a refill, or the mornings I walked to the pharmacy with exact change in my pocket, praying the total would not be a cent more. I closed my eyes and felt the sting of memory. There was the winter the pipes in my duplex froze solid, and I had to choose between paying the plumber or filling the refrigerator. There was the summer. The landlord threatened eviction because I was behind, and I swallowed my pride to ask the church for a small loan. And through it all, Clara had been cashing in on my son's faith, writing herself into a life built on my deprivation. She had stolen not just money, but dignity, turning my years of survival into her luxuries. I could see her in those missing dollars, silk blouses, polished nails, dinners at restaurants where a single meal cost more than my week's groceries. Michael slammed the portfolio shut, the sound sharp enough to startle even himself. His voice cracked as he muttered, "I thought I was helping you. I thought all this time you were comfortable." His shoulders slumped forward, the image of a man crushed under the weight of realizing he had been both generous and blind. I reached for my coffee mug, though the liquid inside had gone cold hours ago. Holding it steadied me. "Son," I said quietly, "money can be stolen, but what hurts worse is trust." The air in the room thickened. Outside, the branches rattled against the window as if the night itself wanted to listen. Clara's shadow stretched long in my memory, each smile, each small intrusion suddenly reframed as part of a larger theft. Rage pressed at the walls of my chest, begging for release, but I swallowed it back. Rage is quick. Justice is patient. My hands had held too many tools to know the difference. I leaned closer to the box of papers, each line a breadcrumb. "We'll trace it," I whispered, more to myself than to Michael. "Every cent she took, every lie she wrote in my name. We'll dig until the whole rotten thing is pulled into the light." Michael sat still, his jaw tight, his eyes burning. The realization had finally settled in him. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had built his life beside, had been siphoning his love and his father's survival into her own pockets. He looked at me as though searching for an anchor, and I gave him what I could, calm, steady, unshaken. Because if Clara had built this lie like a fortress, then it would take more than fury to tear it down. It would take patience, grit, and the kind of endurance forged only in men who had already lost everything once before. The next morning carried no warmth, only the kind of pale light that makes the world look bare and cold. Michael picked me up before the frost had melted from the grass, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. Neither of us spoke much on the drive. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was filled with questions neither of us dared voice. When we pulled into the bank's parking lot, the glass doors glared back at us like teeth. I straightened my old coat, the seam at the shoulder fraying, and followed my son into the marble foyer where money ruled and truth too often bent to its weight. We were ushered into an office, a sterile room with a wide desk and certificates hanging proudly on the wall. The representative, a man in a navy suit with the kind of smile trained for disarming complaints, asked what he could do for us. Michael did the talking at first, his tone clipped, each word edged with restrained fury. He laid down the papers, the transfer records, the proof that money had been sent somewhere under my name. The banker clicked through his computer, brows knitting as the details unfolded on his screen. Yes, he said after a moment, there is indeed an account here under Samuel Hartley. Active, consistent deposits. Address on file is Birch Avenue, apartment 3C. He looked up confused. That's you, correct? I shook my head slowly. I have never lived on Birch Avenue, not a single day. My voice was calm, but inside me, something twisted, the way metal bends under too much pressure. The banker frowned, turned the monitor slightly so we could see. There it was, my name spelled correctly, my date of birth, but an address foreign to me. Worse still, the signature on the original account application appeared. He slid it across the desk for me to examine. My heart pounded as I leaned forward. The loops, the strokes. It was my name, but not in my hand. Someone had studied me close enough to mimic the way I wrote, but it lacked the weight of years, the unevenness of calluses pressing pen to paper. It was a forgery, a cruel mask of my identity. Michael's hands curled into fists. How could this happen? He snapped. The banker cleared his throat, uncomfortable now, and muttered about verification processes, about documentation that must have been provided, an ID, a utility bill, things that should have confirmed the truth. My stomach sank as the pieces began to align. Clara had handled my mail, my bills, even my identification once or twice under the guise of helping me. She had gathered the keys to my life long before I realized I had handed them over. I looked at Michael, whose face was pale with disbelief, and then back at the man behind the desk. "That's not me," I said firmly, pushing the paper back across. "That's a thief wearing my skin." The room fell silent, the hum of the computer the only sound. For a moment, even the banker seemed stripped of his polished confidence, as though he too realized we weren't talking about clerical errors anymore. We were staring into the mouth of something far darker, something deliberate. And though my son's fists shook with anger, I kept my own hands flat and steady on the table, because the fight ahead wasn't one to be won with rage. It would be won with proof. The banker excused himself for a moment, leaving us in that cold little office with its polished desk and walls hung with framed certificates meant to inspire trust. Michael paced the length of the carpet, his shoulders tight, his fists clenching and unclenching as though he could squeeze sense out of the air. I sat still, because years of survival had taught me that stillness is sometimes sharper than motion. When the man returned, he no longer wore that trained customer service smile. His face was heavier, his voice quieter. "Mr. Hartley," he said, "there are clear irregularities here. Based on what you've told me and on what we've uncovered, this appears to be a case of fraud." Michael nearly exploded at the word, but I lifted a hand, steadying him. I wanted every syllable recorded in my memory, every turn of the knife documented, so that later no one could say we hadn't seen it coming. The banker advised us to file a formal complaint and bring the police into the matter. He spoke of fraud alerts, of freezing accounts, of launching an internal investigation. Each word confirmed what I already knew in my bones. This wasn't a mistake. This was theft carefully constructed, brick by brick, until it towered high enough to shadow my entire life. Michael turned to me, his face tight with fury, his voice almost trembling. "She's been doing this the whole time, hasn't she? She's been draining us both." I met his eyes, calm in the way only an old man who has weathered storms can be. "Anger will only blind you now," I told him. "If we want truth, we need patience. If we want justice, we need proof." He swallowed hard, and for a moment I saw him the way I once saw him as a boy, looking to me for steadiness when the world frightened him. We left the bank with folders of evidence tucked under Michael's arm, and a heavy silence between us. Outside, the air cut cold, sharper than any blade, and I felt Grace's absence like a second winter inside my chest. She had always told me that lies rot from the inside until they collapse under their own weight. I realized now that Clara's lies were heavy enough to crush us all if we didn't brace ourselves. As Michael unlocked the car, his jaw tight as stone, I placed a hand on his arm. "We're not victims, son," I said softly. "We're witnesses, and the truth, no matter how ugly, will speak louder than both of us if we let it." He nodded slowly, his anger still burning, but I could see him holding it back, caging it for the fight to come. And as we drove away from that building of glass and marble, I knew the real battle hadn't yet begun. What we had seen was only the blueprint of deceit. What lay ahead would be the tearing down of walls, brick by stolen brick, until every secret Clara had built her kingdom upon was dragged into the light. The following afternoon, Michael arranged for us to meet with an attorney he trusted, a man named Whitaker, whose office smelled faintly of leather and old books, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down and gather weight. He was a tall, silver-haired figure, with eyes that missed nothing, and a voice steady enough to anchor even the most frantic client. When we sat across from him, Michael did most of the talking at first, laying out the timeline of supposed transfers, the discovery of the false account, the forged signature. Whitaker listened without interruption, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, nodding only once in a while, as if marking milestones along a long road. When Michael finally leaned back, exhausted from recounting it all, Whitaker turned his attention to me. "Mr. Hartley," he said gently, "tell me what your life has looked like these past 2 years." His request was not for documents or numbers, but for testimony, so I spoke plainly. I told him about the duplex with its leaking roof, about the bills I juggled like knives, about the nights I counted coins to fill a prescription. I told him about the loneliness of holidays spent in a house too quiet without grace, about the cold mornings when I boiled water on the stove just to chase the frost from the air. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I simply told the truth of a man who had been left to endure, while money meant to ease that suffering had been siphoned away. When I finished, Whitaker exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing with a quiet anger that was not for me, but for the injustice laid before him. "You've been robbed, Mr. Hartley," he said firmly, "not only of money, but of dignity, and if what I suspect is correct, the law will call it by its proper name: identity theft, fraud, forgery." Michael shifted uncomfortably, guilt flickering across his face. He admitted in a low voice that Clara had often been the one handling paperwork, that she'd taken over correspondence, that she'd insisted on helping me with bills and documents. His voice cracked when he said he should have seen it sooner. Whitaker leaned forward, his tone crisp now, all business. "Here's what we must do. First, we'll file a police report. Then we'll place fraud alerts with the credit bureaus. We'll subpoena bank records, track every transfer, and demand access to county property documents. We'll peel back every layer she's built, one by one, until the entire structure collapses." He paused, studying me. "But this will take time, and it will test your resolve." I nodded, my jaw set. Years of labor had taught me patience, and years of grief had taught me endurance. "I've carried heavier loads than truth," I said quietly, "and I won't drop this one." Michael looked at me then, something new flickering in his eyes. Not pity, not just shame, but recognition. For the first time, he seemed to see me not as the father scraping by in shadows, but as the man who had taught him how to fight storms without letting them swallow him whole. And in that moment, I knew we were no longer just uncovering fraud. We were reclaiming what it meant to be family, even if it meant burning through lies to do it. Whitaker wasted no time. He spread the documents across his desk like a surgeon laying out his instruments, his sharp eyes scanning each line with the precision of a man who had seen countless schemes but never grew numb to them. "Fraud of this scale doesn't happen in isolation," he said, tapping one page with the tip of his pen. "Someone close had to gather the right materials: social security numbers, identification, utility statements. Without those, an account like this couldn't be opened, let alone sustained." His words sliced through the air, steady and undeniable. Michael's face tightened, his hands locked together so firmly that his knuckles whitened. "Clara was always involved," he admitted reluctantly. "She handled my scheduling, my business paperwork, even some of my father's bills when she claimed she wanted to help him." His voice faltered. I felt the weight in his words, the reluctant confession of a man who had trusted his wife too deeply, only to realize she had turned that trust into a weapon. I let my gaze fall to the worn floorboards of Whitaker's office, and the memory came rushing back. Clara in my kitchen, sunlight slanting across the counter, her voice light as she asked for my driver's license to confirm something with the bank. Clara standing by Grace's cedar chest, her hand lingering a moment too long on the old brass key before lifting it from my palm. I had thought nothing of it then. How could I? She had asked with the sweetness of a daughter trying to honor the family she married into. But the chest held more than photographs and letters. It held the bones of my identity, insurance papers, tax returns, medical records, all the documents someone would need to become me on paper. The realization hollowed me out. She hadn't stumbled into this scheme. She had studied me, piece by piece, harvesting details like a farmer gathering grain, storing them away until the time came to forge an entire life in my name. Michael lowered his head, shame etched into every line of his face. "I thought she was being considerate," he whispered. "I thought she cared for him, wanted to take some burden off his shoulders." His voice broke on the last word. Whitaker leaned back, his pen resting on the pad. "She wasn't helping," he said flatly. "She was preparing. Every signature, every copied detail was groundwork. She was patient enough to make her crime look like kindness." His words landed with the weight of truth, undeniable and cold. I drew in a long breath and let it out slow, steadying myself. Betrayal didn't come in a single moment. It came in echoes, in the realization that every act of supposed generosity had been the laying of a trap. I looked at Michael, his eyes rimmed red with disbelief, and I knew the hardest part was only beginning, because the storm wasn't just in the lies she had told. It was in the trust she had poisoned, the family she had corroded from the inside out. And storms like that don't pass quietly. They tear roofs clean off, exposing everything beneath. The next step took us to the county recorder's office, a place that smelled of old paper and dust, where rows of metal filing cabinets stood like silent guards over decades of lives written in ink. Whitaker guided us past the counter, his badge of authority clearing the way, until we sat at a long wooden table beneath humming fluorescent lights. Clerks brought us stacks of property records, tax documents, homestead filings, all the paperwork that tethered a man's name to his existence. I ran my calloused hand over the faded folders, each one heavier than its paper should allow, because I knew inside were the answers that would either confirm or deny the life I had been living. Page by page, the truth revealed itself. Property tax forms stamped with "paid in full," but the address listed wasn't mine. It was Birch Avenue, apartment 3C. Utility records, water and electric, signed with my name, but attached to phone numbers I didn't recognize. Whitaker circled them with his pen, his calm voice cutting through Michael's rising disbelief. "This number," he said, tapping the page, "belongs to a cell phone registered to your wife, Mr. Hartley." The words fell like stones. Michael's face drained of color, his lips pressed tight as if holding back the bile of betrayal. I studied the signatures scrawled across those forms, each one a grot, isky imitation of my hand. The loops of the S in Samuel, the slant of the H in Hartley, they were close enough that a clerk behind a desk would never question them. But to me, they were wrong. They lacked the weight of years, the uneven press of a man who had signed his name after a lifetime of work, his fingers stiff with calluses and age. I traced the forged lines with my finger, rage simmering low in my chest, not hot and wild, but cold and patient, the kind of rage that waits for the right moment to strike. Michael slammed one folder shut, the sound sharp against the quiet hum of the office. "She built an entire world in his name," he muttered, his voice thick with fury and disbelief. Whitaker's expression didn't change. He had seen such schemes before, but even he admitted the breadth of it was staggering. "This wasn't sloppy," he said. "It was deliberate. Whoever did this knew exactly what they needed, and where to find it." I leaned back in my chair, the ceiling lights glaring down on me, and let the weight of it settle. Clara hadn't just stolen money. She had stolen my very existence, written herself into the official record, as if she had the right to rearrange my life. And in those stacks of paper, signed with my name but soaked in her deceit, I saw not only the theft of property and funds, but the erasure of who I was supposed to be. It wasn't just fraud. It was the rewriting of a man, the stripping of his dignity on paper. And I swore then, as my hands gripped the edge of that table, that I would not let her false version of me outlive the truth. Whitaker sifted through the piles with the patience of a man who had seen too many lives twisted by greed. Each page he pulled forward revealed another thread in the same rotten tapestry. There were change of address forms filed with the post office, directing my mail to Birch Avenue. There were forged requests for tax extensions, filed under my Social Security number, written in handwriting that wore my name like a mask. There were even utility applications, gas, water, internet, each one submitted under Samuel Hartley, each one neatly rerouted to the false life Clara had constructed. Michael sat beside me, his face pale, his hands locked into fists against his knees. "This is more than theft," he muttered, his voice low, ragged. She didn't just steal money. She stole his identity. She turned him into a ghost. His words landed heavy, because that was the truth of it. On paper, I wasn't the man who had fought winters alone, scraped through months on scraps, and endured nights without heat. On paper, I was someone else, someone who lived comfortably in an apartment on Birch Avenue, bills paid, taxes filed, accounts steady, and yet that man had never drawn a single breath. Whitaker laid the documents flat, his pen tapping the edge. "This is methodical," he said. "Someone had access not only to your personal information, but to your physical documents. This wasn't casual fraud, it was a campaign. She set up false accounts, redirected correspondence, and wove a paper trail strong enough to fool banks, utility companies, and even the county." He looked at me with a steady gaze. "She wanted not just to take from you, but to become you in the eyes of every institute." John. The realization hit harder than I expected. I had survived loss, loneliness, and labor that broke me down year by year, but this felt different. This was erasure. To steal a man's money is one thing. To steal his very name, to file his existence into false drawers and counterfeit records, that was a theft of the soul. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to breathe slow. Fury would do no good if it burned itself out too quickly. Michael finally lifted his head, his eyes blazing with a mix of betrayal and rage. "I gave her everything," he whispered. "Trust, comfort, access, and she used it all to destroy the two people who should have meant the most to her." His voice cracked on the last word, and I saw in him not the powerful businessman, but the boy who had once wept in my arms when his mother died. I placed my weathered hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "She can forge signatures, she can reroute bills, she can even build false homes on paper, but she cannot change the truth, son. The truth is still ours." My voice was calm, but inside I carried the cold steel of resolve. Clara had built her fortress with ink and deception, but I had spent a lifetime with hammer and stone. And what she had built, I would see torn down, piece by piece, until the truth stood naked in the light where no lie could hide. Whitaker didn't waste time. Once the evidence was secure, he advised Michael to confront Clara, not with rage but with the quiet precision of a man already holding the winning hand. That evening, in the dim light of Michael's living room, the confrontation began. Clara sat perched on the edge of a chair, her polished nails tapping against the armrest, her eyes darting between us like a cornered animal searching for an exit. Michael's voice was low, steady, but I could hear the fracture beneath it as he laid down the truth piece by piece. He showed her the transfer records, the forged documents, the account registered at Birch Avenue. Every word he spoke was a nail hammered into the coffin of her excuses. For a moment, Clara tried to deny it. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, the same smile she had used 100 times to disarm suspicion. But it faltered when Michael dropped the stack of papers onto the table with a weight that seemed to shake the floor. Her mask slipped, and the silence that followed told us everything. When she finally spoke, her words were not of innocence but of justification. "I did it for my parents," she said, her voice trembling but sharp with defiance. "They were drowning in bills, medical costs, debt they couldn't escape. I couldn't just stand by and watch them suffer while he," she gestured at me with a flick of her hand, "had money flowing in every month he didn't even use." Her reasoning was a dagger twisted cruelly. I leaned forward, my voice calm, though my hands burned with the urge to tremble. "That was my son's money, his care for me. You stole not only from me, but from him." Clara's eyes flashed, a mix of guilt and resentment, as if my words dared to strip her of the righteousness she had clung to. Michael's face hardened, his jaw set like stone. "You didn't save your parents," he said bitterly. "You bled my father dry and lied to me every day while you did it." His voice cracked, the pain raw, as if betrayal itself was tightening around his throat. Clara pressed her palms together, desperate now. "It was supposed to be temporary," she pleaded, "just until they got back on their feet. I was going to make it right." But the words rang hollow in the quiet room, bouncing off walls already lined with years of deceit. I watched her carefully, her body hunched forward, her eyes wet, not with true remorse, but with fear. Fear of the collapse she knew was inevitable. The silence that followed was heavier than any outburst could have been. Michael's gaze stayed fixed on her, cold and unwavering, while I sat in the shadows of the room, the weight of years pressing down on me. In that silence, something shifted. The pretense was gone, the mask shattered. The truth stood naked, and there was no refuge left for her in excuses or tears. What remained was only the raw betrayal, jagged and undeniable, carved deep into the very heart of the family she had pretended to belong to. The following days, moved like a storm, spreading wider with every hour. Whitaker, tireless as ever, pressed forward with filings and calls until the circle of deceit Clara had woven began to unravel at its edges. It wasn't just the bank anymore. It was the government itself that had been tangled in her scheme. Investigators from the IRS arrived with files thick as bricks, their expressions carved from stone. They laid them out on Whitaker's desk. Fraudulent returns filed under my Social Security number, bogus deductions, fabricated addresses, all stamped with dates that mocked the years I'd gone without heat or medicine. Every page was another theft, not of dollars alone, but of the life I had been forced to endure in silence. Michael sat rigid beside me, his face ghostly pale as the evidence stacked higher. His hands trembled when they showed us surveillance stills from the bank. Grainy images, but clear enough. Clara, in her tailored coat, standing at the counter, pen in hand, opening the very account that had swallowed nearly $100,000 meant for me. Her chin was lifted in that way she always carried herself, like someone above suspicion, like the world owed her trust without question. Seeing her frozen in those frames was like watching a snake shed its skin, the truth finally visible beneath the charm. I didn't flinch. I studied each photograph the way I once studied blueprints before laying pipe or repairing wiring. Every detail mattered. The tilt of her wrist as she signed, the confident ease in her posture. It was the body of someone who believed they would never be caught. Michael, though, could not bear it. He pressed a hand over his eyes, shoulders shaking with silent rage. I shared everything with her, he whispered, voice raw. My home, my trust, my life, and she used it all to strip my father bare. Whitaker's voice cut through, calm and sharp as a blade. This is no longer just fraud. This is federal identity theft, forgery, and conspiracy. The evidence is overwhelming. She won't walk away from this. His words landed with the finality of a gavel, and in that moment I realized the storm was not only consuming Clara, it was consuming all of us. Sat back, steady, my palms flat against the oak table. Grace's voice echoed in my memory, telling me that truth is a slow river. It carves stone not with violence, but with persistence. I had waited years in the shadows of poverty, enduring silently, but now the river had found its course. Clara's lies had been patient, meticulous, but so was the truth. And truth, once set loose, doesn't stop until every hidden corner is washed clean. When Whitaker suggested we see the property with our own eyes, I braced myself. The drive out to Lakewood was quiet, the kind of silence that clings when words feel too heavy to carry. My hands rested on my knees, steady but cold, while Michael gripped the steering wheel as if the leather itself might keep him from unraveling. The closer we drew, the clearer the water shimmered through the trees, its surface calm, deceptive, like a mirror that hides more than it shows. And then, suddenly, there it was, the lake house. The one my son had believed he had given me. The one I was supposed to have lived in for 2 years while I patched leaks in a duplex and boiled water for heat. It was beautiful, I won't deny that. White siding that gleamed against the blue, a porch stretching wide like open arms, and windows that caught the morning light as though the house itself were alive. But it wasn't mine. It never had been. What cut deepest wasn't the house itself. It was who lived inside it, Clara's parents. We saw them through the wide front windows, moving about comfortably, as though they had earned the right to call it home. Her father was on the porch, sipping coffee in a sweater too fine for a man who once complained of endless debt. Her mother watered potted plants that lined the steps, each bloom bright, fed by money stolen from me. Neighbors waved as they passed, friendly, unaware, and one even called out, "Beautiful place you've got here." The words hit like stones. To them the story was simple. A daughter-in-law ensuring her family was cared for, while the old man in the duplex across town was forgotten. I stood there with Michael, my son frozen beside me, the truth laid bare in the casual ease with which her parents lived in the house meant for me. My chest tightened, not from envy, but from the cruel irony of it all. I had been invisible, while my name was paraded in paperwork to justify their comfort. Michael's face hardened as he watched them laugh on that porch. He whispered, almost to himself, "All those nights I thought of you warm and safe here. They were living it instead." His voice cracked, and in that moment I saw the weight of his shame press him down. He had trusted his wife, and in doing so, he had unknowingly abandoned his father to struggle alone. I laid a hand on his shoulder, steady, though my heart thundered like a drum. This isn't your shame, son, I told him. This shame belongs to her, to them, to every lie they built on our backs. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening until it shook. Together we turned from that house, its perfect porch and blooming flowers, knowing it was nothing more than a monument to betrayal. The neighbors could whisper, the windows could gleam, but truth had already put cracks in its walls. And truth, I knew, always finds a way inside. Whitaker moved swiftly after the visit to Lakewood. He filed civil complaints demanding restitution and criminal charges that carried the full weight of the law. Fraud, forgery, identity theft. The words rang in my ears like tolling bells, each one a name for the wounds Clara had carved into my life. The figure they calculated was staggering. Nearly $100,000 siphoned through deception, funneled into accounts, and a house that had worn my name like stolen skin. To Michael, it was a financial crime. To me, it was decades of sacrifice mocked in ink. As we sat together in Whitaker's office, the papers spread before us like maps of a battlefield. Michael's face was lined with grief that went deeper than numbers. I should have seen it, he whispered, his voice raw. I thought I was helping you, Dad. All those years, I believed you were cared for. He dropped his head into his hands, the image of a man whose pride had been shattered. I reached across the table, my hand heavy on his arm, and spoke with the calm of someone who had weathered storms long before. Son, guilt doesn't rebuild what she tried to burn. Truth does. Justice does. That's the work in front of us now. The complaint documents were thick, bound tight with evidence. Emails forged in my voice. Utility records in my name, but tied to Clara's phone number. Surveillance footage showing her standing at the bank counter with false confidence. Whitaker detailed the charges with a steady rhythm, his pen striking the paper as he spoke. Restitution for the stolen funds, penalties for tax fraud, prison time for identity theft. Michael sat silent, his eyes fixed on the photographs of Clara's parents smiling on that stolen porch. His silence was heavier than any outburst, the kind that cracks a man slowly from the inside. For me, the weight was different. It wasn't about numbers on paper, it was about years. Years of patched boots, of skipped meals, of lonely winters, where a warm house could have been mine if not for her theft. I thought of Grace, how she would have grieved to see her family fractured by deceit, and I felt her voice steady me. Hold the line, she seemed to whisper. The truth will do the rest. When we left Whitaker's office that evening, the city lights flickered against the windshield as Michael drove. His grip on the wheel was tight, his jaw harder than stone. He spoke only once, but it was enough. I'll stand with you in court, Dad. Every step. His words carried no hesitation, only resolve. And in that moment, though betrayal had nearly broken us, I knew we were no longer walking through it alone. The fight ahead would be long, but the truth was already sharpening its edge. The courthouse was colder than I expected, its walls a blend of stone and silence that seemed to swallow sound whole. Michael walked beside me, his stride heavy but certain, while Whitaker carried the stack of evidence like a man bearing scripture. We sat together at the plaintiff's table, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight shift off my shoulders onto something larger, the Millionaire, a kinnery of justice itself. Across the room, Clara sat stiff-backed, her hair pinned neat, her expression carved from stone. She wore the look of someone clinging to control even as it slipped through her fingers. The prosecution laid everything out in methodical strokes, bank records showing deposits rerouted into the false account, property documents stamped with my forged signature, utility records and tax returns tethered to an address I had never seen, surveillance photos of Clara at the bank counter, pen in hand. One by one, the witnesses spoke, a banker who confirmed the ID had been used to open the account, a county clerk who testified the documents bore my name but not my presence, and even a neighbor from Birch Avenue who described seeing Clara come and go from the apartment tied to my false life. Each testimony was a nail, hammered deeper into the coffin of her defense. Clara tried to hold her composure, but when her attorney finally called her to the stand, the cracks showed. She spoke in rehearsed tones at first, insisting she had done it for compassion's sake. I only wanted to help my parents, she said, her voice trembling just enough to seem human. She claimed the money wasn't wasted, that it kept them afloat when they would have drowned in debt. But Whitaker rose, calm and precise, and began to peel her words apart. He asked why she had forged signatures if her intentions were so noble. He asked why she had rerouted tax filings, why she had hidden bank statements, why she had allowed me to freeze through winters while she lived comfortably in a house bearing my name. Her mask slipped then. The tremor in her hands betrayed her. She stammered, searching for words that might soften her guilt, and finally, under the relentless press of truth, she whispered the words that sealed her fate. I did it for my parents. Not for me, not for Michael, for them. The courtroom air tightened around those words, and the silence that followed was heavier than any outcry. I sat still, my heart steady, my breath slow. For months I had known the truth in my bones, but hearing it in her voice made the betrayal whole. She had taken what was mine and used it not to honor family, but to erase me in favor of her own blood. I felt Michael's hand grip mine under the table, firm and unyielding, and in that moment, surrounded by stone walls and watchful eyes, I understood that the storm was almost over. The truth had spoken, and it carried a weight no lie could match. The jury didn't take long. Hours of testimony, weeks of filings, mountains of evidence, all of it pointed in one direction. When the foreman stood, paper trembling slightly in his hands, I could hear the hush sweep across the courtroom like wind through dead leaves. We find the defendant guilty on all counts. The words rang out clear, sharp, final. Fraud, forgery, identity theft. Each charge struck like the clang of an iron bell, tolling for every lie Clara had woven into my name. Clara sat frozen, her face drained of color, her lips parted as though she wanted to object but no words would come. The judge's voice followed, measured and heavy. Sentencing, years in prison, restitution for the stolen funds, the legal stripping away of the false entity she had built. For the first time since this began, she looked small, not the polished woman who had commanded rooms with charm and deceit, but a hollow figure caving under the truth she could no longer escape. Michael bowed his head, his hands pressed together like a man in prayer. I could see the shame in his eyes, not for his own deeds, but for the blindness that had allowed hers to thrive. When the gavel struck, he exhaled sharply, as if he had been holding his breath for 2 years, and finally let it go. Beside him I sat still, not triumphant, not vengeful, only steady. Justice is not joy. Justice is the absence of lies. As guards led Clara away, her gaze swept over us, searching perhaps for pity or forgiveness. But I gave her nothing, not hatred, not mercy, only silence, because some wounds are too deep for words and some truths too heavy to soften. Michael's hand gripped mine under the table, strong and certain, and I felt the bond between us harden again, reforged in the furnace of betrayal. He whispered, almost to himself, I'll never let this happen again. Later, in the dim corridor outside the courtroom, the air smelled faintly of dust and old stone. Michael turned to me, his eyes red but his voice steady. I'm ending it, Dad, the marriage, everything. She won't hold another piece of my life hostage. His words were not sharp with anger, but weighted with resolve. I nodded slowly. Divorce was not a victory. It was a burial, the sealing of a chapter written in lies. As we stepped into the daylight, I felt the sun on my face, thin but real. The fight had been long, the wounds deep, but the truth had carried us through. And while the world outside went on, as if nothing had changed, I knew everything had. For the first time in years, my name was mine again, untainted, unbroken. And though justice had come at a cost, it had come all the same. The first time I stepped into the lake house as its rightful owner, the silence pressed against me like a stranger's stare. The rooms were bright, the air faint with the scent of polish and cedar, but beneath that sheen lay the ghosts of deceit. Every floorboard, every curtain, every piece of furniture felt borrowed, stolen, as though they were mocking reminders of winters I had suffered without heat while this place stood warm in my name. I moved slowly through the hallways, my fingers brushing the walls, trying to claim them as mine, though they resisted at first, whispering of nights spent sheltering people who had no right to them. Michael walked beside me, his face taut with shame. He carried boxes of paperwork, receipts, legal notices, evidence that the house now belonged where it always should have. Yet I could see how hollow he felt, how every corner of this place reminded him of trust squandered, of a wife he no longer recognized. He paused by the window overlooking the lake, where sunlight scattered in ripples across the water, and his voice was low when he spoke. All this time, I thought you were here. I thought you were safe, cared for, and instead you were freezing. His words trailed off, broken by regret. I placed my hand on the frame of that wide window and steadied he. In the way fathers do, not with grand speeches, but with quiet strength. You gave the gift, son, I said. She stole it. That shame is not yours to carry. His jaw worked as he swallowed hard, and for the first time since the trial, I saw a glimmer of release in his eyes. He wasn't free yet, but he had begun to let go of the chains her lies had wrapped around him. As the days passed, I began to settle the house piece by piece. I stripped away curtains that smelled of her perfume, cleared closets of clothes that didn't belong, burned old papers in the fireplace until ash curled into the chimney like gray wings flying free. Slowly the house began to yield, to let me in, to feel less like a monument to betrayal and more like a place where Grace's memory might find rest. I placed her photograph on the mantel, her smile gentle, her eyes steady, and for the first time the room seemed to breathe differently, as though they recognized the truth had finally come home. Standing there, I thought of the years I had endured without knowing this place existed, and I realized that justice does not erase suffering. It only draws a line between what was stolen and what was reclaimed. My life had been carved raw by betrayal, but here, in this house of wood and water, I felt the faint stirrings of something I thought I'd lost forever, belonging. And though the scars would never vanish, I knew I would fill these rooms with truth, one day at a time, until the ghosts had nowhere left to hide. The lake shimmered gold in the late afternoon light when Michael brought his boy to visit. My grandson's laughter carried across the yard, high and unbroken, the kind of sound that heals places words cannot reach. We pitched a tent together on the lawn, just canvas and poles, nothing grand, but to him it was a fortress, a castle, a world all our own. As he crawled inside, dragging his sleeping bag with the seriousness only a child can muster, I felt something stir in me that had been buried beneath years of loss and betrayal. Hope. Not the kind that promises perfection, but the kind that grows steady roots in the soil of truth. Michael stood nearby, hands in his pockets, watching us with a quiet smile. The trial had hollowed him, the divorce had left him raw, but here he seemed lighter, freer, as if the chains of deceit no longer clung to his shoulders. He caught my eye, and in that glance was a promise, not spoken but etched deep, that he would never again let lies come between us. I nodded, the gesture small, but it carried the weight of forgiveness and the strength of love reforged in fire. Inside the house, Grace's photograph watched from the mantel, her smile steady as ever. I liked to think she approved, that she saw the family we had salvaged from the wreckage. Clara had tried to rewrite my life, to steal not just money, but identity, to erase the man I was and replace him with her invention. But she had failed. The truth had endured. And now, on this patch of earth by the lake, the legacy she had tried to corrupt was being rebuilt, not with lies and stolen paper, but with the laughter of a child and the bond of a father and son who had found their way back to one another. As dusk settled and the tent glowed faintly from a lantern inside, I sat on the porch and let the night air wash over me. Betrayal had nearly broken me, but it had not defined me. Justice had been served, but more than that, dignity had been restored. I thought of all the listeners who might hear my story, scattered across the world, and I felt the urge to reach out beyond the quiet of the lake. If my words could find them, perhaps they too would know that truth, though slow, always wins in the end. So if you've stayed with me through this long road, I thank you. Share this story, let others hear it, and stand with me in believing that no lie, no matter how carefully built, can outlast the strength of a steady heart and the light of the truth.